there is what we would call the Anglican Church, although in England they call it the Church of England. So what happened there? We mentioned that that Martin Luther was excommunicated in 1520. And in 1521, Henry VIII wrote a book. He authored a book defending the faith against Martin Luther. And what was interesting, and I think that was a correct year, he rejected Protestantism. He did not agree with Protestant ideas. So he wrote against Luther, and the Pope gave him the title of Defender of the Faith, because he was. It was well written. It was strong. It condemned the heresies of Luther. So Henry VIII was called Defender of the Faith. And even to his dying breath, he was not a Protestant. So his break from the church was more a schism. Now, he maybe began to adopt some Protestant ideas, but for the most part, during his life, Lutheranism didn't come into England, but it did after his death. So what was his downfall? Well, his downfall, very simply put, was lust. King Henry VIII had married a woman named Catherine of Aragon, so from Spain. And I believe, I don't remember all the details, but I believe that she was his brother's wife. And of course, for a man to marry his brother's wife after his brother dies, that would be an impediment. But it's an impediment of church law, not divine law. So therefore, it can be dispensed by the church. The church can dispense from her own laws, and that's what the Pope did, for him to marry Catherine of Aragon. Well, he got tired of Catherine, and so he became interested in one of her ladies-in-waiting, who was Anne Boleyn. And I was reading this over the weekend. I want to see if I can find it. And it goes into the different wives. I think he ended up having 6 or 7 different wives. 2 of them he beheaded. He claimed they were unfaithful or whatever and had them beheaded. So a pretty gruesome story or history there. There was Jane Seymour, and I don't remember all the names. But again, 2 of them beheaded. So Henry VIII's problem was lust. And he was not given his annulment. He appealed to the Pope to be able for the Pope to declare that his marriage with Catherine of Aragon was invalid, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. Well, the Pope refused because it was valid. She was his lawful wife. The church had granted him that dispensation which he needed to marry her. Now, the Pope can't just turn around and say, well, I'll annul it, because an annulment means it wasn't valid from the beginning. But once the annulment was given, he married her, that was a valid marriage. So he repudiated Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. I think her name is spelled E-Y-N, Anne Boleyn. At any rate, that didn't last very long. He got interested in someone else, rejected her. Altogether, I think there were 6 marriages. So Henry VIII, 6 different women that he married. And as I mentioned, 2 of them he beheaded. The others he just repudiated them and married someone else. Now, of course, someone who wrote a book defending the faith, how do you pacify your conscience? You're living in this way. Well, he got a bishop who was very subservient to him to come to England, and this bishop had actually been, I don't remember the whole story, exiled from England because of his heresies. This bishop had become Lutheran in his thinking, very Protestant. So Henry VIII welcomed him back to England because he approved of his marriage with Anne Boleyn. And his name was Thomas Cranmer. So Cranmer is the one that brought into England Protestant ideas, because Henry VIII himself didn't believe in, the Bible alone and all of that. What Henry VIII claimed was that since he was the king in England, he was the head of the church in England. So I'll put that up here. Henry VIII claimed to be the head of the church in England. And to this day, sovereigns in England claim the title of Defender of the Faith, which the Pope gave him, which is interesting because they reject the Pope, but they claim that title of Defender of the Faith and head of the church in England. And we'll get into, Anglicanism and as it spread, but in England, they call it, as I said, the Church of England. We would typically refer to it as the Anglican Church. But in this country, it's called the Episcopalian Church. So if you hear of Americans who are Episcopalians, then that means they follow the Church of England. Episcopalians. And notice that word episcopus, which means a bishop, because John Knox didn't like the idea of having bishops, so he called his movement the Presbyterians. Well, then there was someone else in England that started a group and didn't want bishops or priests, and they were called Congregationalists. And the first pilgrims that came to Plymouth Rock, and they were Congregationalists. They were from England, and they were being persecuted in England because they wouldn't be part of the Church of England, and so they came to America. But they were Congregationalists because they believed that each congregation was autonomous and supreme, and they could elect whoever to be their minister, and they didn't have any kind of ordination, anything like that. So Cranmer then wrote a new book for the sacraments, etc., and it was approved by King Edward VI. So this is what happened in England. You had Henry VIII, and he reigned from 1509 to 1547. He died in January 1547. Well, the way the laws were at that time, he had one son, and he had at least a couple of daughters. Well, the son was from Jane Seymour, one of his wives, but he became king after Henry, his father, and he was called Edward VI. And Edward VI was born in 1537. He became king in 1547 because, upon the death of his father. He wasn't even 10 years old. He was just over 9 years old, 9 years and a couple months when he was made king. And he died in 1553. Now, so for 6 years. Well, when you have a boy that dies, becomes king when he's 9 and dies when he's 15 years old, he's not going to be running the kingdom. You have a regent. You have someone that's oftentimes maybe his mother or whatever. And I don't know who that was. But the point is, during his reign, this is when Cranmer railroaded through whatever he wanted to do. And so England they were schismatic under Henry VIII when he broke with Rome, which was in 1535, I believe. Now it became Protestant in teaching due to Cranmer and other reformers. Well, after he died at a young age, like I said, he was 15 years old, 15 or 16, he was succeeded by Queen Mary. Now, Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and his true wife, Catherine of Aragon. So she was really legally, she should have been the sovereign after Henry VIII. And what Mary did is that she reunited England to the Catholic Church. Her reign was 1553 to 1558, so 5 years. And there was a cardinal from England, Cardinal Reginald Pole, who was sent by the Pope to reunite Catholics, to absolve them of their schism and so forth, and reunite England to the Roman Catholic Church. And that's what happened under Queen Mary. Now, you know what she's called by historians? Bloody Mary. There's even a popular alcoholic drink called a Bloody Mary, right? With like tomato juice in it. So she is referred to as Bloody Mary, and I'm sure she did execute certain people. But it is nothing like her successor. And after she died, did she die a natural death? Or was she executed? I didn't have time to look that up. But at any rate, she was only the queen for 5 years. After her, her half-sister, Elizabeth, became the sovereign. Now, Elizabeth, which now we would go by Elizabeth I because there was a second who just died, a year or two ago. But Elizabeth was reigned from 1558 to 1603, and so a long reign. 47 years, I think, 46, 47 years, and she ruthlessly suppressed Catholicism, both in England and in Ireland, and she is really the one that should be called Bloody Elizabeth. She was ruthless in trying to root out Catholicism. There were many, many martyrs at the time of Elizabeth. Now, she was so bad, so here you had this brief reunion with Rome under Queen Mary, and now it all went to heck under Elizabeth. Just totally enforced Protestantism. Well, because of her crimes, at a certain point, she was excommunicated by Pope St. Pius V. Now, Pope St. Pius V was Pope from, I think, 1565 to 1572, thereabouts. He had a glorious reign, accomplished so many things. Of course, we think of the Battle of Lepanto, the Quo Primum Bull in the Roman Missal. So he reformed the Missal, the breviary, enforced the decrees of the Council of Trent, etc., and obviously was a saint, very holy man. But he excommunicated her for her crimes and absolved Catholics from allegiance to her. Well, many historians say that that was an imprudent or an unwise decision on his part, because that just excited her wrath, her anger against the Catholic Church, and it just became much more, the persecution, much more bloody, much more gruesome, etc. Many Catholics were put to death, many priests. You think of saints, or they're beatified mainly, like Edmund Campion, Margaret Clitheroe, different ones under Elizabeth. And at that time, they're Catholics who didn't go to the Anglican services. They would be fined with very heavy fines. And so it kind of forced a lot of Catholics, not that it's any justification, to finally just give in. But those who remained Catholic, they would have to pay the fines, etc. And before Henry VIII, or I could say at the beginning of his reign, there were numerous monasteries in England, numerous monasteries, church lands, church institutions of different kinds, monasteries, convents, etc. So all of that was taken away from the Catholic Church and distributed to high-ranking, Protestant nobles, etc. So all the goods of the church basically taken away. So as this historian that I was reading over the weekend said, that Henry VIII's downfall was lust and greed. But I don't know how much Henry VIII really wanted the monastery. Certainly a lot of the nobles who went along with him did. Now, Cranmer, as I mentioned, came out with a new, prayer book called the Book of Common Prayer. But there was also a book of the form for the sacraments. And it was called the Edwardian Ordinal. It was called the Edwardian because Cranmer came out with it when Edward was king, and he signed off on it. So the Edwardian Ordinal. So an ordinal is like a missal or a sacramentary, a book with the different forms. Now, there was a discussion about this over the centuries, and several popes commented on it and ruled that Anglican orders were invalid. So that was 3 different popes had ruled on that. But it wasn't a sort of final, once-for-all, solemn type of teaching. So Pope Leo XIII in 1896 came out with an apostolic constitution called Apostolicae Curae. And the gist of it was Anglican orders are invalid. So Anglican priests and bishops today, they don't have valid orders, whereas the Eastern Orthodox do. And he goes through the reasoning in this apostolic constitution. But what's really great about it is not only that he decided that once for all, but he went through the theology of the sacraments. He just talks about the purpose of the sacraments, the signification of sacraments, what we call the res sacramenti. So a Catholic theology, it's an excellent treatise explaining Catholic theology on the sacraments. But what they found, those researchers, etc., those who helped him do the research and writing it, is that all the Anglican orders go back to one bishop, and his name was Matthew Parker. So, you know how a bishop would trace his lineage as far as he can. So, Bishop Viverunas would say, I was consecrated by Bishop Carmona, who was consecrated by Bishop Took, and then you could go on beyond that as far as you would have, records. Well, any Anglican bishop today, or at the time of Leo XIII, would have to trace their succession of orders back to this one man. And so that made it easy for Pope Leo XIII. And he determined that Matthew Parker was an invalid bishop because of the form in this Edward Ordinal that Cranmer came up with, which was not a valid form. So he ruled that Anglicans do not have valid orders. But what's interesting today, the Anglicans have had for some time, I don't know how long, women priests and women bishops. And they have the head bishop is called the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he doesn't have authority over the other Anglican bishops in the same way that a pope would have authority over Catholic bishops. But he's like given the primacy of honor, not a primacy of authority, just given honor as being the Archbishop of Canterbury. His name now is Welby, I think. But Canterbury has always been, before Henry VIII, kind of the primatial see of the Church in England. The primary see. And that is the city where Thomas à Becket was the bishop. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And you can go to the cathedral, and I've been there, you can go to the cathedral in Canterbury today, and they show you the exact spot where Thomas à Becket was martyred. And that brings up another side point, interesting. And again, I didn't have enough time to research this, how much was due to Henry VIII or how much was after he died. But one of the things they did in England is they destroyed Catholic shrines. So a big thing in England during the Middle Ages before Henry VIII was pilgrimages. Well, because of the English Channel, you'd have to take a boat. It was harder for people in England to go to Rome, or to go to the Holy Land, or to go to Compostela, as many Catholics in continental Europe did. So a big thing was visiting the shrine of Canterbury where Thomas à Becket was martyred. You even have a famous book or famous work called The Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. And the whole gist of it is there's a group of people on pilgrimage and they're stopping at an inn along the way and telling stories. You might say swapping stories. So that's how he writes the Canterbury Tales. But many people would go on pilgrimage to Canterbury to venerate the spot where Thomas à Becket was martyred. Well, again, it was either Henry VIII or one of his successors. They exhumed the body, burned it, and dumped the ashes into the river just to eliminate it. You can go today to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, And you can see the statues on the outside of the cathedral that are broken off. They're beheaded or broken off. And that was done by the Protestants, either under Henry VIII or shortly after him, to eliminate the idea of statues. So, they obviously took over all the Catholic churches, what had been Catholic churches, and made them Church of England, Anglican churches. When the hierarchy was reestablished in England with Cardinal Wiseman by Pope Pius IX, I think 1860s or thereabouts, they had to build a cathedral. And so that's in Westminster. Cathedral Westminster is the Catholic cathedral, the main cathedral of Catholicism. And of course, from the time of Elizabeth up until that time when the hierarchy was reestablished in England, Catholics were basically persecuted and in hiding and that type of thing. Now, thinking about the Anglican Church today, there has been a fracturing, as happens in all the Protestant churches, of the people in England. Matter of fact, this book that I was reading, he quotes from an Anglican who says, "We have no unity in our church." And this was an Anglican priest or, an upper educated person, because there isn't any unity. So the Anglican Church today, they have what they call the High Church. They have the Low Church. And they have the Broad Church. And so what those terms mean is the High Church Anglican. So if you go to a church that's the priest, the Anglican clergyman, Anglican priest, is of High Church thinking, then it's going to be similar in ceremonial to Roman Catholicism. They use incense, they'll use vestments, etc. So that's the High Church. I'll tell you another story about that in a minute. The Low Church is like Protestantism. It's just basically like Lutheranism, many of the same ideas, etc. And then you have the Broad Church in between. So my story was, I was in New Zealand years ago, it was like 30 years ago, more than that, 35 years ago, and someone came up to me after a lecture with a book and wanted me to, is this book okay? And I was looking at it as a prayer book, and I always looked for an imprimatur, and I couldn't find one. And interestingly, it had the mysteries of the Rosary, it had the Stations of the Cross, and it had many prayers that we might use. But there was something wrong, and I kept looking, and I finally found it. It was an Anglican book. So that's the High Church. Now, this started, especially in the 1800s, there was a movement called the Oxford Movement, because it started in Oxford, which is just a little bit outside London, kind of the premier university in England. They started this movement, and the movement was to bring back the Church of England to Roman Catholic practices. And they came up with a theory, and they called it the branch theory. And the branch theory said that the church Christ founded is like the trunk, the Christian church. And it has branches. And the Roman Catholic Church is one branch, and the Eastern Orthodox Church is a branch, and the Anglican Church is another branch. So they say, we're different from Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox or others, but we're still a branch from the trunk of the church that Christ founded. And of course, that's false. Pope Pius XII, in his masterpiece encyclical called Mystici Corporis, on the mystical body of Christ, says the Church of Christ is the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church is the church Christ founded. You can convert those two sides of that equation. Roman Catholic Church, church founded by Christ, and vice versa. And so this was just an attempt to justify themselves in remaining Anglican. Now, there have been many famous Anglican converts, and the Oxford movement, even though it was an attempt to say that we're legitimate, You know, we are from Christ, even though we're separate from the Roman Catholic Church. We can trace ourselves. We still are, you know, a branch of the Christian Church, etc. And so most of those in this Oxford movement remained Anglican. That was they're trying to justify remaining Anglican. Well, it did lead to many converts. One of the most prominent was Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman. Now, Newman was made a cardinal towards the end of his life, and he never became a bishop. I think he was a priest, but he was a prominent Anglican convert. Another very prominent one was Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson. And what's interesting about Benson, a number of books, very fascinating. And he died at a relatively young age. I think he was in his mid to upper 30s or so. But he was the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop, who's the head Archbishop, he was his son. And he became a Roman Catholic priest. Faber was a convert. I don't remember all of them, you know, right now, but there were many famous, wonderful Catholic converts from Anglicanism. In this country, there was we have the Chair of Unity octave in January, and that was started by Father Paul Watson. Well, Paul Watson was an Anglican clergyman. He converted to Roman Catholicism, went to a seminary, and was ordained then a true Catholic priest. But he was a convert from Anglicanism. So there have been many, you know, over the years. But that idea of the different branches, etc., and different groups in Anglicanism shows the lack of unity. Now, I mentioned Canterbury. Canterbury is probably by car, I think it's about 2-hour drive south and east, primarily east of London. But when St. Augustine of Canterbury was sent to England by Pope Gregory the Great with like 20 monks or so from the monastery in Rome, when he went there, that's where they settled, and the King of Kent, as it was called at that time, he was converted in, and so they established their first church there in the town of Canterbury, but it's much smaller, very small compared to London. But still, that's where the first, you know, bishop took up his residence and so forth. So Canterbury had that dignity. But that's why the head bishop of the Anglican Church is always the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's a beautiful cathedral, old, you know, cathedral, still like it was at the time of St. Thomas of Becket. Another little interesting tidbit about bishops of Canterbury, there was one named, I think, Stephen Langston, and he was a Catholic bishop before Thomas of Becket, you know, around 1000 or 1100 or so. And he's the one that wrote the verses for the Bible. I mean, numbered all the lines in the Bible. And you know how people quote chapter and verse. It was Catholic bishops, Catholic writers, and it was another Catholic who divided the books of the Bible into chapters, and I don't remember his name. But I think Stephen Langston was the name of the Bishop of Canterbury who went through and numbered all the verses, and it's used to this day by both Catholic and non-Catholic, and of course it's a good reference to be able to identify a quote from Scripture. But England had a wonderful Catholic culture and history up to the time of Henry VIII. And what's interesting about the schism of Henry VIII is that, you know, you could think about this. The Pope could have saved that country for the Roman Catholic Church by just giving in to Henry VIII and giving him his annulment. And I've heard this quote that a Pope said to, you know, Henry would send his ambassadors to Rome, etc. And he said, if I had 2 souls, I might lose one of them for Henry, because I'd still have another one to say, but I only have one, and I'm not going to throw it away just to give in to Henry. So the church did not want it, but that was the right thing to do, to refuse the annulment. There was no grounds for it. And so we lost, you know, the Roman Catholic Church lost this nation, basically, at least for several hundred years, although like I said, when the hierarchy was reestablished in the mid-1800s, there were a lot of converts in England. A lot of them came back, and, you know, like you read Father Faber, just wonderful writings. I mean, he wrote hymns that we use, like Faith of Our Fathers, etc. He was just an outstanding theologian and writer. and so many others as well. But this is a sad fact of history. The Anglican schism from the Roman Catholic Church, and it all was Henry VIII wanting to repudiate his wife, wanting to remarry. And so his final decision was, well, if the Pope won't give me an annulment, I'll declare myself head of the church in England. And of course, if you've seen the movie Man for All Seasons on the life of St. Thomas More, he refused to sign the oath of subjection or oath of submission, but the nobles and the priests and bishops had to sign this under threat of being put to death if they didn't sign it. And his conscience told him he couldn't do that. The only bishop that I know of that refused to sign it was John Fisher, and he's a saint. He was also executed, as was Thomas More, St. John Fisher. So at least there were great saints and martyrs. Interesting little tidbit. When I was in London many years ago, actually, 1996 to be exact, I visited the Tower of London, which is their big prison there. And there's only one person who ever escaped from the Tower of London, because security is so tight as ever. He was a Catholic priest, a Roman Catholic priest. And somehow they smuggled a rope into him, and he tied it on the inside in it, and he was able to, go down the rope. And I don't know if they had a boat waiting, because it's right on the river, the Thames River. So I don't know if they had a boat waiting for him, but he escaped